Hello, my fellow true crime content consumers. It is that time again for me to cover another unsolved true crime case for you all. If I haven't made it clear by now, on this channel I talk about true crime cases, solved, unsolved, current, and cold cases alike. If this is the type of content you are interested in, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave likes, comments, share these videos if you have a moment. Let's continue to grow this channel. I know that the true crime community is very supportive. My overall goal is to spread awareness for cases, and hopefully one day this channel will eventually become a big enough platform to really make a difference. I did want to take a moment to thank you all so much for the constant support. I truly appreciate every comment, every like, every person who took a moment to subscribe to the channel. The last couple of cases I have covered have been solved cases. It was while I was recording audio for the last case I covered, which was case 24, a killer throws a party after murdering Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, which if you haven't watched or listened to the case yet, I'll leave a link somewhere on the screen now if you want to check it out. But it was while I was recording that case that I realized that I haven't covered an unsolved case in a couple of months. So I do what I always do, and I went down the rabbit hole of the plethora of unsolved cases that exist in the world. I knew I wanted to cover a case that hasn't gotten the amount of coverage that it truly deserves. After about 3 hours of scrolling through unsolved cases, I found one that I had never heard about before, and as soon as I read about her and her story, I knew immediately that I wanted to cover this case. What happened to this 21-year-old woman is very brutal. I will go ahead and throw up my disclaimer on the screen now. Not only will I be talking about the horrendous murder of a young single mother, but this case also involves the brutal attack of her son, who was just 7 years old at the time. Both of her very young children were there when this murder took place, and that just makes this case so much more worse and demented. This is a very upsetting case, and yet I've seen only a handful of YouTubers and podcasters cover this one. I believe that if this case had gotten the coverage that it deserved to get at the time when it happened, then this case would have been solved by now. Let's get started. This is the brutal, unsolved murder of Laneshia Crowder. Laneshia Crowder, who went by Lane to her friends and family, was born on July 21st, 1979. Unfortunately, due to there not being a lot of information available for this case, we don't know a lot about who Laneshia truly was, which is very upsetting for me personally. If you have been with this channel for a while, then you know how important it is for me to share as much information as I can about the victims that I talk about. These are real human beings, each with their own individual personalities, with real feelings, likes, dislikes. They deserve to be remembered for who they were while they were alive, and not just as a victim of a true crime case. I truly believe that. I hate that cases like this exist where no one really bothered to learn anything about who the victim really was. What was Laneshia passionate about? What did she like to do on a day-to-day basis? What were her hopes and dreams? Well, sadly, the majority of these questions cannot be answered. But I will go over what we do know about Laneshia. She was a young, hardworking mother who undeniably loved her children. She dedicated her entire life and supported her 2 kids, a son and a daughter, and she did this all by herself. Anyone in this situation will tell you it's not easy being a single parent. Laneshia worked hard day in and day out in order to take care of her kids financially and emotionally. I have no doubt that it was hard for her because she was so young, and she had 2 children to take care of. She had her loving mother Doris to help her out, of course, but Laneshia strived to get her kids everything they needed on her own. She had her first child, a son named Kenneth, at 14 years old, and despite entering motherhood at this young age, she beat statistics and she continued her education and graduated from Carrollton High School, located in Carrollton, Georgia. Laneshia loved being a mother. That is something that her friends and family would always bring up whenever they talked about her. Shortly after graduating high school, she gave birth to her second child, a baby girl that she named Lyric. Life was normal for this small family. Laneshia continued to work hard. Kenneth was getting older. He, of course, adored being a big brother after his sister was born. They were happy. Laneshia seemed to be a very social person. She had a lot of friends that would check up on her and her kids. They should have had so many more years together as a family. Laneshia should have been able to watch her kids, the lights of her life, grow up. But as we already know, she didn't get to do that. That brings us to August 12th, 2000. Laneshia, Kenneth, and Lyric still lived in Carrollton, Georgia, at 270 Henson Circle, a small two-bedroom ranch-style home. Carrollton, Georgia, is considered a smaller town. At the time of this case in the year 2000, the population was estimated to be around 30,000 people. Often called the Friendly City, Carrollton was known for living up to that name. It's a close-knit community where people actually took the time to get to know their neighbors, which is something that seems to be very rare these days. Laneshia and her kids arrived back home between 9 and 9:30 p.m. after a long but otherwise normal day. It was a Saturday, so they spent the entire day out, and they visited Laneshia's mother Doris toward the end of the day, and then they made their way back home. Once they came back home, it is assumed that Laneshia put Kenneth and Lyric to bed, and she made several phone calls to a few of her friends between 9:45 p.m. and 12 a.m. According to the friends Laneshia had called, they were all normal, everyday conversations. Laneshia sounded normal, happy even. Nothing stood out or seemed out of the ordinary on these phone calls. The last call she made ended shortly before midnight, and that call was the last time anyone ever heard from Laneshia Crowder. What happened next still remains a complete mystery. The next day, Sunday, August 13th, came and went, and immediately Laneshia's loved ones and family members became concerned because they had not heard from Laneshia at all that day. And that was very strange because Laneshia was the type of person to call and talk to the people in her life very frequently. And again, Carrollton is a close community, and whenever anything unusual was going on with someone, it was pointed out very quickly. Although it was out of the ordinary, the loved ones of Laneshia figured maybe she had just been too busy with her kids and she didn't get the chance to reach out to them that day, and that surely she would just speak to them the next day. Monday, August 14th came, and by the early afternoon, alarm bells inside Laneshia's friends' heads were going off, as no one had still heard from Laneshia. At around 9 p.m., one of Laneshia's friends, who had become very worried at this point, called one of Laneshia's neighbors and asked the neighbor to go to Laneshia's house to check on her and the kids. When the neighbor got to the home, they knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Her car was in the driveway still, so the neighbor knew that she must have been home. So this neighbor actually looked through one of the windows, and they could see Laneshia lying on the floor in her bedroom, and she wasn't moving. And if that sight wasn't bad enough, the neighbor also described that Lyric, who was only 2 years old at the time, was sitting on top of her mother, trying to wake her up. The neighbor then ran to another neighbor's house, told him what they had seen, and now two neighbors are at the home peering through the bedroom window. And after this neighbor saw Laneshia lying on the floor not moving and baby Lyric sitting on top of her, the neighbors then immediately called 911. Paramedics quickly arrived at the home around 10 p.m. on Monday, August 14th. When they entered the home, they were met with just an absolutely horrific scene. Laneshia was on her bedroom floor, clearly deceased, and knowing this just breaks my heart into pieces, but Lyric was still on top of her mother, and she was placing band-aids on Laneshia's injuries. Oh my God, just the visual of that innocent 2-year-old little girl trying to put band-aids on her mother is just awful. And it just gets worse because in the next bedroom, they found Kenneth, who was just 7 years old, severely beaten, and he was barely alive. Whoever attacked Laneshia and Kenneth, they severely beat both of them. Thankfully, Lyric was completely unharmed physically. Kenneth was on the brink of death when they found him, and he was immediately airlifted to a children's hospital located in Atlanta. It was touch and go for a while. Doctors didn't know if Kenneth would survive his horrific injuries. Kenneth was beaten and kicked so badly that he had severe head trauma. Laneshia had sustained the same savage beating as her 7-year-old son. Her death was quickly ruled as a homicide, and her cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma. As you can imagine, the murder of Laneshia and the brutal assault of her young son was a complete shock to the community. The neighborhood that the family lived at was a quiet and safe neighborhood, and no one could understand why anyone would want to hurt Laneshia or Kenneth. Police attempted to find some sort of motive for this murder, but to this day, as far as we know, the investigators have been unable to come up with a reasonable motive. There were no signs of forced entry of the home, and there were also no items that were stolen, so they have ruled out the possibility that this had been a robbery gone wrong. There were no damage to any of the doors or windows, so it seems that no one had broken into the home either. Police claim they have collected pieces of evidence for this case, but to this day, they have yet to release a lot of this information to the general public. For example, they claim that they do have the murder weapon that was used to beat Laneshia Crowder to death, but they have not released to the public of what this weapon is. The investigators do have critical information for this case, and I understand that they are trying to keep as much as they can concealed from the general public so that when a suspect for this case is found, investigators would be able to know for a fact if this person was the killer, if they were to reveal information about the crime scene or something about the case that only the killer would know. I do understand this tactic, but after over 20 years and there are still no updates, and on top of that, this case has very little coverage as it is. So in my opinion, it's time for a different tactic to be used. And whether that's releasing more information about the crime scene itself or just some sort of general information that has been found throughout the years, I don't know. I'm not an expert by any means, but something has clearly got to change. While Kenneth spent the next several weeks recovering from his injuries in the hospital, Lyric was temporarily placed into custody of CPS initially because it was feared that once news broke out that both children who witnessed their own mother's murder were still alive, that whoever killed Laneshia could come back for and kill Kenneth and Lyric. 2-year-old Lyric was immediately interviewed by investigators, but she was a 2-year-old baby and she had just went through a very traumatic experience. So at the time, unsurprisingly, she really wasn't able to tell them what had happened. It is believed that the attack took place in the early morning hours of Sunday, August 13th. Maybe a couple of hours after midnight. Let's remember that the paramedics and police didn't arrive until around 10 p.m. on Monday, August 14th. That's potentially between 40 and 44 hours that Lyric was in this home with her mother's dead body and Kenneth was laying unconscious in the next room over with his nearly deadly injuries. That's almost 2 full days that these young children were suffering. With the evidence that they were able to collect, which includes the murder weapon, the police were very hopeful in the beginning that this case would be solved. Loved ones of Laneshia were interviewed, but no one was able to provide any reason or any person who would want Laneshia, let alone her 7-year-old son, dead. Based on there being no evidence of a break-in, most people, including the police and Doris Crowder, Laneshia's mother, believed that the killers had to be someone that Laneshia knew and trusted enough to let them inside her home in the middle of the night. I was only able to find one person of interest that was ever involved in the case, and this was reported to be an ex-boyfriend of Laneshia. There was an early report that there were several domestic calls to the police while Laneshia was living with this ex, but he was ruled out quickly because he was confirmed to have been incarcerated at the time of Laneshia's murder. As weeks turned into months, the case began growing cold, as no new information has come to light. It's almost 24 years later now, and there has never been any arrests or any suspects for this case. It took a very long time for Kenneth to recover, but he has never been the same after the vicious attack. Kenneth to this day suffers from his traumatic brain injury. He is a true warrior. He beat the odds. He survived a brutal attack and survived almost 2 whole days without having medical assistance after this attack. It is a true miracle that he is alive. It's widely believed that the person or people who killed Laneshia and attacked Kenneth thought that Kenneth was dead when they left the house, which is so beyond disgusting that whoever did this not only beat Laneshia to death, but they also seemingly without hesitation were okay with beating and killing a 7-year-old little boy. When Kenneth was well enough to be released from the hospital, his grandmother Doris, God bless her, she without any hesitation sought and gained custody of both Kenneth and Lyric. She left her job that she had been with for 20 years and gave it up so she could raise her grandchildren. It wasn't easy for Doris to take this responsibility. On top of Kenneth healing from his physical injuries, soon after getting custody, both Kenneth and Lyric began suffering mentally. Kenneth started to get back his memories from that night, and as Lyric was getting older, she started telling Doris that she also had memories from that horrible night as well. Doris Crowder has stated, quote, "They tell me every night what happened, that he kept kicking her," end quote. Even though Lyric was only 2 years old at the time, she remembers a lot from that night. Here is a clip of Lyric explaining this herself.
A single mother with 2 children brutally murdered as they watched in horror.
So we're talking about 2 decades later, and the family is still desperate for answers. I had a chance to speak with the surviving children who witnessed their mother's vicious murder 20 years ago.
I remember that feeling of, is my brother and my mom okay? I just remember trying to, comfort them afterwards. I remember sitting there. I didn't think she was dead, thought she was asleep. But other children who go through that, they're going to remember that for the rest of their lives. And when people sit there and say, oh, they're not going to really remember it, they do. They really do.
It's heartbreaking that she remembers feeling terrified for her mother and brother. Having such a traumatic event like this happen at just 2 years old, I cannot imagine the long-term psychological damage that both Lyric and Kenneth went through. As you can imagine, Kenneth struggled a lot throughout his life with his TBI. He has had issues with learning and retaining memories, but like I said, he is a warrior, and he was able to graduate from high school at 22 years old, despite everything he had been through. He has an amazing and beautiful family. His grandmother and sister have always loved and supported him through every hurdle he comes across. Despite his TBI, he also has memories from that night. Here is a clip of Kenneth describing some of the events that he remembers.
I knew something was wrong. I couldn't tell it, but I knew something was wrong. I told my sister to hide. And then they just came in the door and started beating my mom, started beating me.
Now in his late 20s, Kenneth still lives with brain injuries from the beating, but he says he remembers some details about that night, including more than one killer.
This is only starting. Then I shut my eyes. Then I woke up in the hospital.
Here's the timeline according to police. Lane returns home with Lyric and Kenneth at 9:30 Saturday night. She talks on the phone with friends until midnight. Investigators believe she was killed in the early morning hours of Sunday. Monday night, a neighbor checks on the house, sees a body on the floor, and calls police.
We think that it wasn't a planned out thing. More than likely, it probably was a heat of the moment kind of deal.
I definitely believe Kenneth had saved his baby sister's life that night by telling her to hide when whoever murdered Laneshia showed up. And since Lyric remembers hiding behind the door as she watched her mother and brother's attack, I don't think that the killers knew that she was even there, and that's why she was unharmed. The fact that Kenneth and Lyric both claim that there were 2 people involved in Laneshia's murder is very shocking. With 2 killers, you would think that at least one of them should have been tracked down or discovered by now. But yet this case still remains as a cold case. I wanted to talk about this case because I truly want this case to have more awareness. This is such a heartbreaking case. Innocent children's lives were forever changed. Laneshia Crowder was only 21 years old when she was murdered. Her case has been unsolved for more years than she got to breathe on this earth, and that's just completely unfair. Laneshia and her entire family deserves to have justice, and they have not given up hope that one day her case will be solved, and the assholes that beat her to death will one day face justice. Laneshia seemed like such a sweet and beautiful person. What happened to her makes me sick. The image of Kenneth laying on the floor, unconscious, after potentially 2 people kicked and beat him to the point where he was barely alive, kills me. Lyric trying to help her mother, not understanding that she was gone, placing band-aids on her injuries, kills me too. Thinking about Laneshia missing out on her children's lives is so infuriating. Lyric is now a mother to her own young child, and now this child gets to grow up without having their grandmother in their life. The entire situation is outrageous. So please, if anyone can take a moment, share this case. I don't care if you share this specific video. I don't care. Just please share this case. It needs to have more awareness. Pull up an article of Laneshia Crowder's story. There are articles online. Share that on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, Facebook, all of the above. Anything you can think of, please continue to share Laneshia Crowder's story. Social media is an amazing resource. It reaches everyone around the world, and it would be amazing if Laneshia Crowder's case was shared and covered more. Comment down below your thoughts about this case. I will read all comments. I want to engage with you all. If you have any theories, I want to see them. If anyone has any information that relates to the murder of Laneshia, please contact Agent Larry Duren at 706-565-7888 or the Carroll County Sheriff's Office at 770-830-5888. I will also leave these phone numbers in the description box down below. But that is all I have on today's case. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hopefully I'll catch you guys on the next video. But until then, bye guys.